Because I think a focus on mortality is a useful thing to have, and that's why I begin my book with it. You should always know
before you knew
that your time is very limited, and that you're lucky to live in a time and place where you can be healthy till you're 60, as I was. Most people in history have never had a chance even to hope for a thing like that.
Indeed.
So, no, for the avoidance of hubris, I think it's good to have a sober feeling of the presence of death.
Christopher Hitchens would have been 63 years old today. The British author and journalist died in December last year due to complications caused by cancer of the esophagus. Martin Amis once wrote, he thinks like a child, that is to say, his judgments are far more instinctive and moral, visceral than they seem, and are animated by a child's eager apprehension of what feels just and true. He writes like a distinguished author, and he speaks like a genius.
It's not for everybody. Not everyone wants to always be an awkward cuss or out of step or against the stream. But if you do feel that the consensus doesn't speak for you, if there's something about you that makes you feel that it would be worth being unpopular or marginal for the chance to lead your own life and have a life instead of a career or a job, then I can promise you it is worthwhile, yeah. Half the time when I was arguing with the so-called anti-war movement, they would say their reason for opposing the war was that if it began, Saddam Hussein would obliterate huge numbers of Americans and Israelis and neighboring countries by his weapons of mass destruction. That was their case for peace, that he had the weapons. So now, in other words, people have to take part in their own deception. The only revolution which has a chance of being worth emulating, worth studying for other countries was pluralism, religious freedom, separation, secular separation, and the right of anyone to try and make a living their own way and worship their own God. It's may not sound very grandiose, but it's not bad, and will serve. And most of the countries I've been to in the past few years would all be taking a step up if they moved in that direction, and most of them know it. So to discover that, after it's all shaken out, that the American Revolution still has some life and purpose and meat and muscle in it, is, I think, a rather inspiring thing for someone of my age. I didn't think I'd have another chance to take part in a revolution. And now, in fact, the United States is involved in a combat that is Jeffersonian around the world. The worship of non-existent entities, the attempt to derive morality from the supernatural, all of that is more, I think, than mistaken or irritating. It's becoming actually very menacing now. The people who think they have permission of that sort from the heavens are trying to kill us.
Hitch rose to prominence with books such as Letters to a Young Contrarian, God is Not Great, and his memoir, Hitch 22. But as much as anything, he was famed for his love of friendship.
Here is something I admire deeply about you two, is the notion of friendship. You form bonds with Martin Amis, Julian Barnes, Ian McEwan, and others.
I've been very lucky with my contemporaries, I think. They taught me how to write.
They taught you how to write?
Well, more important, perhaps, how not to write. I was a rather didactic, rather polemical writer when I first got to know them. I was writing for the cause, rather. I wasn't paying very much attention to style. They pointed out to me, it can be enjoyable to read and write things, as well as a duty to do so. Introduced me to writers I hadn't appreciated enough, like Nabokov, for example. Broadened my outlook, deepened my feeling for language, as well as providing me with a wonderful context of, yes, amusing friendship.
Michael Weiss once said friendship was his ideology. As Christopher liked to put it, friends are God's apology for relations. Joining me now, 4 friends, very good friends, who knew him better than anyone I know. They are Martin Amis, author of The Rachel Papers, Money, and The Pregnant Widow. James Fenton, former professor of poetry at Oxford. Ian McEwan, author of Atonement, Saturday, and Solar. And Salman Rushdie, author of Midnight's Children, The Satanic Verses, and The Enchantress of Florence. They have written more, but that was a list of some of them we will refer to now. I am pleased, especially pleased, to have them here to remember, reflect, appreciate, talk about Christopher Hitchens, one of the favorite guests here on this program over the last 20 years of our existence. And I began with Martin Amis. Give me a sense of who he was.
That's difficult. he was the only friend I've ever had. I think this is a mark of friendship that isn't much explored. That you can say anything to, no matter how shameful, how horribly revealing of yourself. You can admit to all your worst impulses, and you don't. I never felt I had to tailor it to fit in with his idea of me. It was a candor that established itself instantly and never wavered. But how to sum up the Hitch? He's a very unusual man. He flirted with ideology in a way I think that no one else at this table ever has. He was, in fact, strongly ideological, and it was not until the fall of communism in 1989 that he really blossomed as a writer, I think. And even then, he was sort of looking out for other ideologies to hitch his wagon to for a bit. And that's what gave us his peculiar stance on Iraq. He wasn't bien pensant, he wasn't very commonsensical. That's why people loved him, because he seemed to be having the major argument with himself, as if only the Hitch was worth arguing with.
Yeah, James?
Well, when I first knew him, he was absolutely the leading figure, one of the leading figures on the revolutionary left in Oxford. And for our last year, we shared a house together. And he was, I have to tell you, I don't think it's a secret, he was a very bad Trotskyite. He was on the lazy side. I often used to think...
He was not getting up at 8 to go to the barricades, was he?
Well, I can remember putting the mug of coffee beside his bed, going back downstairs, then coming up, knocking on the door again, saying, "Christopher, please get up," and then realizing that when he did get up, the coffee was going to be cold, and he was going to go through that revulsion at the first mouthful of cold coffee, making the extra cup of coffee and so on. And the first thing, practically, that we did together, the first significant thing, was we went to his revolutionary group, which I wasn't yet a member of, and they used to meet in rooms above pubs, you know, rooms that were normally used by an organisation called the Elks, so there would be sort of elk horns around. And we went to one of these rooms for the meeting, and the plan was, a friend and I, we said, the reason why Christopher hasn't been coming to the meetings is that he's been working so hard proselytizing, and here we are as new members of the prospective new members of the group. So we got him, we saved him from being thrown out of the Trotskyist movement. That was the first thing we did.
Yeah.
Last time Hitch came to my house, maybe 2 years ago in central London, it's an endless repetition, and we've all experienced this. The face, the great hairy unshaved face, came right into yours, demanding that manly kiss. And on the last occasion, Martin was already in the house, and I think your memory of this is not as distinct as mine. And he said, "Before I come in, before you pour me a drink, there's a woman on the other side of the square being harassed by some yobs, and we've got to go across and sort them out." And Martin and I looked at each other. Great. He said, "There's only 7 of them. Come on, there are 3 of us." So we set off across the square. 2 of us, very reluctant soldiers, this little private army. And we got there, thank God, there was no one there. They'd all gone. And I think of this story because he was a street fighter. I mean, intellectually, and also he's chased villains down the street. He did it in Washington, some mugger he pursued. And I remember years ago in Manhattan, he pursued someone.
He got
on
roughed
Avenue
up quite
C.
badly, rescuing a woman from an abusive friend.
And that could have been you and me.
He got roughed up.
Yeah.
He got roughed up erasing graffiti.
Absolutely, in Beirut.
In
It was
Beirut, yeah.
No, he was putting the graffiti up. He was writing some anti-fascist graffiti, and then the fascists jumped him.
But I remember when I first met Christopher later than Martin and James knew him. I met him at the Notting Hill Carnival in somebody's house, and he was suspicious of me because I had friends on the left who were not the kind of left that Christopher approved of. So he thought I was going to be.
What sort of friends do you mean? Name names.
I'm going to not name names. Tariq Ali. And he thought I would be, therefore, unsuitably leftist, and was relieved to find that I was more suitable than he had feared. But the Street Fighter thing is true, and I was very struck that when God Is Not Great came out and he had to go on tour for it, instead of doing the normal book tour, which all of us do, he asked for adversaries to be provided everywhere he went. He asked the publishers to set him up with Christian opponents, in every city.
Local priests,
local priests, and etc. And of an absolutely opposite position, and he would take them on. And that was his nature. He would want the debate.
And he knew his Bible.
He knew his, yes.
Yeah, I saw one of those with Tony Blair.
Yes, that's right. That was late. He took on Blair. But demolishing Blair is not the hardest thing to do. But he did it. Now, I thought that was very characteristic, that instead of just going to read from his book and do a signing, he actually everywhere he went, he wanted to take somebody on.
He had hundreds of people in book lines saying to him, "Thank God you've come. We are not just the Bible Belt." There were plenty of secular...
Each of you is defined by writing. Is he more defined by debate than writing?
Well, I slightly disagree with what Martin said about 1989 being when he sort of became a writer, because I don't think it was something unpremeditated, unthought of in his scheme of things. I think 1989 was something he would have welcomed at any time, i.e. the fall of Eastern Europe, of communism. But he would have welcomed it from a socialist point of view. And I think that, but I do think that before he went to the States, he wasn't really at his best as a writer as such. He was extremely political, extremely good in conversation, he'd always been very, very good in debate. He was a marvellous public speaker. But he was a bit on the sloppy side with the writing. But then in the States he became more and more of a writer. And I think this was it was perhaps a slower development for him than it had been for other people around this table.
George Orwell was his what, Martin? He was what Saul Bellow is for you?
Maybe. Hitch always used to stress that he said it's very important that to recognize that Orwell wasn't a genius, that his strength was a kind of exalted common sense. But it's amazing how often Orwell turns out not only to be right, but to have said the best thing about any number of subjects.
Christopher was a very good hater. I mean, he'd started off really hating a sequence of people who were worth hating. He hated Henry Kissinger. He hated Mother Teresa. And later on, he hated Bill Clinton. Yeah. And I think those were vehement, but they weren't just emotional. They were highly articulated, thought-out hatreds.